Hey guys, today we're doing the follow-up video for Getting Lost number 5, Underworld. If you have not seen that already, I highly recommend that you watch that first by clicking the link right up here. Otherwise, this video of my ramblings will probably make even less sense than it already does. Now that said, if you happen to be in Japan, you may not be able to even see that video. And that's because in it, I used a song called Sailing by Christopher Cross. And because of that, the video was restricted for copyright reasons. And as a consequence of that, this video apparently is not available in Japan. So on the off chance that somebody is seeing this, and you happen to be in Japan, and would like to watch that video, there is a link in the description of this video to an alternate version of Getting Lost number 5 that has had that song removed so that you can watch that one. Now, as one last little disclaimer before diving in, I have to say that Getting Lost number 5 is by far my most popular video. And because of that, the comment section of that video is absolutely full of very in-depth and very engaging, interesting conversations about Lost and about specifically the topics that are addressed in that video. And so in having to pick and choose what I wanted to address in this video, it really felt like I was barely scratching the surface of all of the interesting input that I received. Unfortunately, if I covered every bit of every conversation in that comment section, then this video would be several hours long, and I'm pretty confident that nobody wants that. So what this basically means is that throughout this video, I will probably repeatedly encourage any viewers of this video to go and check out the full conversations in the comment section of Getting Lost number 5. If you find the things being discussed in this video interesting, then I am pretty confident that you will find it worth your time to scroll through those more in-depth conversations. But all right, let's get into it.
So it's just as possible that a group of Egyptians might have fled Roman rule in search of a new land where they could hope to return to the glory of their ancestors.
So this brings me to an awesome comment from someone named Michael Scott. I'm not 100% sure that's how that's intended to be pronounced. So as usual, I apologize for any mispronunciations. This user's full comment should be on the screen, and I definitely recommend pausing this and reading the entire thing. It's basically an impressively comprehensive breakdown of the different cultures that likely came across the island, as well as the probable approximate timeline of those encounters. But one of their first points is one that I really felt worth talking about briefly, and that is where they say, the island in the ancient period was placed somewhere in the eastern Mediterranean between Italy, Greece, and North Africa. So this is an interpretation that I absolutely share. As we know, the island is constantly adrift, and when the underground wheel is turned, it obviously immediately transports the island somewhere else. So yeah, there's a theory out there that before the wheel was ever implemented, and it was just adrift originally, that it was located in the Mediterranean Sea, and that is why all of these ancient cultures seem to have come across it. If this was indeed where the island was originally located, it would have been right in the middle of ancient Mesopotamia, ancient Egypt, ancient Greece, and ancient Rome. And as we know, there is evidence that each of all 4 of those civilizations came across the island at some point. The Egyptians and the Romans being the more obvious examples, but the fact that we see both Cuneiform and the Greek language written on the stone plug and Jacob's tapestry, respectively, it seems likely that both Greeks and Mesopotamians at some point were present on the island as well.
Such a relationship is further evidenced by the existence of a chamber whose sole purpose seems to be to summon the monster.
So user Rochelle23 actually had a question about the summoning chamber. And that was, do you think that the smoke monster could really be summoned? Because in episode 616, talking about the summoning chamber, Ben says, "It's where I was told I could summon the monster. That's before I realized that it was the one summoning me." What do you think about that? So do I think that this chamber actually had the ability to summon the Man in Black? I do, primarily based on the translation of the hieroglyphs, which I believe is to summon protection. And of course also because when Ben uses it in season 4, obviously the monster does appear. So I do believe that that drain we see is connected to the Man in Black in some way. But that is not at all to say that I believe he is forced to come once he has been summoned. Based on what I believe the Egyptians' relationship with MIB looked like, I don't think they ever had or even tried to attain power over him. Basically, I think that the chamber was designed for them to call for help from their deity, should they need it. But in no way do I think he was compelled to answer that call if he didn't want to. As for what Ben says specifically, that's where things get even more interesting in my opinion. I've stated in other videos that the Dharma Initiative building that house and that secret room around that chamber seems to indicate that they were trying to prevent its use. And based on everything we see, it seems that once the others took over the barracks, they too had that policy of not using the chamber. This is evidenced by the fact that Ben has ample opportunity to use the chamber when the mercenaries attack the barracks, and yet he does not do so until they kill Alex and he declares that they have changed the rules. So if you take this apparent policy of not using the chamber and combine it with the fact that Ben says what he says in season 6 in front of Richard.
What's that? A secret room? It's where I was told I could summon the monster.
This seems to imply, at least to me, that Richard is not the one that told Ben this. And given that Richard is the one with some limited knowledge of the fact that the smoke monster is a sort of enemy to Jacob, it makes sense that Richard would not have been the one to tell Ben this. So in my mind, this leaves us with two very interesting possibilities for who would have told Ben that. The first is that Horace Goodspeed, the former occupant of that house prior to the Purge, told Ben this at some point when they were in the Dharma Initiative together. I've previously talked about how I believe that Ben was very much in the inner circle of the Dharma Initiative as he grew up. So it does seem plausible to me that Horace would have confided that in him, although, yeah, the exact reasons for why that would be aren't clear. Or the other option is, and I do think this is the more likely and more interesting one, is that the Man in Black himself is the one that communicated this to Ben through a dream. The series is full of examples where the Man in Black is communicating to people through visions and dreams. It's one of the main ways that he manipulates people into doing and believing the things that he wants them to. In the episode Cabin Fever, this very much seems to be what is happening with Locke. He dreams about Horace Goodspeed telling him how to find a map to the cabin, where the Man in Black, as Christian, is waiting for Locke so that he can manipulate him into doing the things that he wants him to do. And in that same episode, Ben even says,
I used to have dreams.
and given that context, the implication seems to be that the dreams he's referring to were prophetic in nature the way John's are. So taking this idea of Ben getting this information from a dream and applying it to what Ben says in season 6 about how it was really the monster summoning him.
It's where I was told I could summon the monster. That's before I realized that it was the one summoning me.
I think that's the way that line makes the most sense to me. Essentially, after having now discovered the nature of the monster and what it has been working towards all of this time, I think Ben has deduced that dream was generated by the Man in Black.
Now, here is the plug-like stone Desmond finds at the source in 2007. Note the writing is a combination of Cuneiform and Egyptian hieroglyphics.
So this brings us to a comment from a user whose name I am definitely going to fail to pronounce correctly. But here it goes. Chokas, who says, "My only problem with the timeline is what Damon says about the stone cork on the audio commentary, and the fact that the stone cork includes cuneiforms from Akkadians and Sumerians, suggesting an even older civilization being present on the island, coming from Mesopotamia, ancient Iraq. What do you make of it?" So yeah, in my opinion, this is very much a similar situation to that of the ancient Romans versus ancient Egyptians. Because ancient Egyptian civilization predates ancient Roman civilization considerably, it's natural that on the surface, people think that the Egyptians arrived before Jacob and the Man in Black, because Jacob and the Man in Black arrived with Romans. So similar to that, cuneiform indeed existed long before any other form of written language. So it is also a reasonable deduction that whoever wrote that language arrived on the island prior to both the Egyptians and the Romans. However, as in the case of the Romans versus Egyptians, there actually is a considerable overlap. Cuneiform was used as late as the 2nd century AD, which is obviously well after both ancient Rome and ancient Egypt had existed for quite a while. So while there are other feasible explanations that you could come up with for why that stone cork has both Egyptian hieroglyphs and cuneiform on it, I think that the easiest explanation is that around the time of the Egyptians being on the island, another group from around present-day Iraq also arrived on the island and ended up assimilating with the Egyptian community. Like I said, that's far from the only explanation that you could come up with to explain this. For example, you could theorize that Mother came from a Mesopotamian culture, and it was her people that originally built the plug and wrote that layer of the spiraled text on it. And perhaps their intention to use that on the source led Mother to kill those people. And then perhaps eventually the Man in Black found it, and then his people, the Egyptians, added the hieroglyphic layer of the spiral text. I just think that the first explanation is the more simpler one. I also prefer something more in line with the assessment that Michael Scott had given in the comment I addressed earlier about Mother appearing more Greek based on her clothes more than anything. But yeah, based on my understanding, cuneiform was still used in that region of the world around the time that the Egyptians would have been present on the island.
The cork is this island. And it's the only thing keeping the darkness where it belongs.
Such a description of the island was never given to Jacob by Mother, nor did the job she laid out for him have anything to do with keeping evil contained.
Speaking of Mother, user Johan Unique says, "The big mystery in the ancient history of the island seems now more than ever the adoptive mother of the 2 Roman kids. From which civilization is she coming from?" So yeah, as I just said a moment ago, I personally really like the idea that Michael Scott referenced, that being that she is Greek in origin. That said, I don't have a super fleshed out theory on what exactly her story was. And there are two main reasons for that. The first is just the complete lack of information there. And the second is that it does not seem to be at all relevant to the overall story. So yeah, my thoughts on her backstory can be summed up fairly quickly. I think, as in most of the other cases, she ended up on the island by accident with other members of her culture, be that Greek or whatever else. I think she then formed the type of communion with the island's energy that we see countless others do. And I think because of that communion, she develops her own interpretation of both the island and its energy, and she decides she needs to protect it. And then based on the fact that she is the self-proclaimed protector of the island, the fact that she is alone on the island when the Romans arrive, and based on what her expressed outlook on humanity is, I think it's pretty likely that she killed the rest of her people out of a desire to protect the source, regardless of whether or not they actually posed a genuine threat to it. Now, how much of her interpretation was correct as far as the island and its energy? I think that's completely subjective. Neither Jacob nor the Man in Black ever completely share all of her beliefs. I've also talked recently about how one of the show's biggest themes is the way that humans project meaning onto things that we can't explain, and how, more often than not, these beliefs cannot be proven either definitively true or false. And ultimately, I think this theme is exactly what the mother is meant to be a physical representation of within the story of Lost. I think the fact that the writers refuse to give us any information about her backstory or how she slaughtered the village, for example, the storytellers want us to do this very thing. They want us to project our own meaning and interpretation onto that character. Now, before moving on, there was another comment that was on the topic of Mother that I did want to address in this video. And that comment comes from user Cucumber Cheese, who says, "Do you have any thoughts on whether or not some form of smoke monster existed before MIB? Perhaps related to Mother or simply existing at the same time as her?" Now, this comment was part of a much larger discussion between me and this user and another user by the name of Carb Rock. So I do encourage you guys to go and check out that full conversation if you feel like it. Like I said, this is just one small part of that conversation. But I did want to address this part specifically in this video because I am very much aware that it is an incredibly popular theory that Mother herself was a smoke monster. I think it's fair to say that most people I've ever talked to about this subject subscribe to that theory. That said, I am not one of them. And the main reason for that is the fact that she was killed by the dagger. Which, me saying that, of course, means I should probably explain my thoughts on that whole situation. Because I am also aware that the subject of the dagger is very much something that is somewhat heavily debated. In the season 6 episode Sundown, when we, the audience, see the dagger for the first time, it's when Dogen is handing it to Saeed and telling him that he needs to go out and stab the Man in Black before he says anything.
I want you to kill him. He will come to you as someone you know, someone who has died. As soon as you see him, plunge this deep into his chest. If you allow him to speak, it is already too late.
Saeed does then go out and stab the Man in Black in the chest. And nothing happens.
Hello, Saeed.
lot of people think that is because the man in black got out the words, "Hello, Saeed." In other words, he spoke to Saeed, and a lot of viewers think that is why the knife didn't work. A lot of these same people who also think that Mother was a smoke monster as well think that the dagger worked on her because she didn't speak to the man in black before he stabbed her. But I strongly disagree with the notion that a character speaking has anything to do with how vulnerable they are or are not to being stabbed. For one, what even counts? Sure, Mother didn't speak to the man in black in the moments leading up to her being stabbed, but she did speak to him the day before. So what amount of time would have had to have passed between her speaking to him and the point at which she would then be vulnerable to being stabbed again? Next, we have the example where the man in black says essentially the same thing to Richard about Jacob when handing him the dagger. He tells Richard that he needs to stab Jacob before he has time to speak to Richard. Otherwise, it will be too late.
Put this through his chest. Do not hesitate. Do not let him say a word. If he speaks, it will already be too late.
But in Jacob's case, we know that he would be vulnerable to the knife regardless of whether or not he speaks to Richard before he gets stabbed. We know that he's flesh and blood, and more importantly, we know that when Jacob does eventually get stabbed to death by Ben, Jacob spoke to him a fair amount before he was successfully murdered by Ben's knife. Well, Locke's knife, but at Ben's hand. So in that case, where the man in black tells Richard to stab Jacob before he can speak, we know in that situation, the man in black is not being literal. He just wants Richard to stab him before Jacob has time to talk Richard out of stabbing him.
If he speaks, it will already be too late. He can be very persuasive.
How can I kill him with this? He's black smoke.
No. I am.
And that is exactly what I think Dogen means when he tells Saeed essentially the same thing. And I feel like I can reasonably prove that. When Saeed returns to the temple after failing to kill the man in black, Dogen's reaction to no other information besides the fact that Saeed is back is to conclude that Saeed let the man in black talk to him.
You let him talk to you.
Saeed then clarifies,
I stabbed him in the chest like you told me to. Then I let him talk to me.
It's at this point that Saeed drops the dagger and says,
That's twice you've tried to have someone else kill me. You had the opportunity to do it yourself. Why didn't you?
And so at this point, Dogen is completely unaware that the man in black said even one word to Saeed before Saeed stabbed him. And he does not deny what Saeed is accusing him of.
That's twice you've tried to have someone else kill me. You had the opportunity to do it yourself. Why didn't you?
I was a businessman once.
If what Dogen had told Saeed was true, that Saeed was capable of killing the man in black if he stabbed him before the man in black had a chance to speak, then the first difference in how we see this scene play out would be that when Dogen sees Saeed return, he would have asked what happened instead of automatically jumping to, you let him talk to you. At which point, Saeed would have said the same thing about how he stabbed the man in black in the chest, like he was told to, but nothing happened, and then he let the man in black talk to him. At which point, Dogen would either have then been baffled as to why it didn't work, or he would have had the follow-up question of, well, did he say anything to you before you stabbed him? And if that point Saeed still got around to accusing Dogen of sending him out there to be killed by the man in black, Dogen would have denied this. But obviously none of that happens, which brings me to what I see as the inescapable conclusion that what Saeed is accusing Dogen of is true. Dogen wanted Saeed to attack the Man in Black so that the Man in Black would kill Saeed instead of then being able to use this man that is now infected. So finally, getting back to the actual point, I absolutely think that people take what is said about the dagger and letting people speak, I think they take that too literally. In both cases where some version of that line is said, Dogen to Saeed and the Man in Black to Richard, each speaker knows that the person they're sending off is likely to be talked out of what they're being sent to do by their target. And that is why in both cases they are saying, don't let him speak to you. If you do, it will be too late. So as I see it, the reason the Man in Black could not be killed with a dagger was because he was not flesh and blood. And therefore, the reason Mother could be killed with a dagger is because she was. Now, the follow-up question that I usually get when I tell people that I don't think Mother was a smoke monster is, how then did she manage to slaughter the village and fill in the well overnight? And my answer is that both telekinesis and pyrokinesis are two of the parapsychological abilities that special people are shown to be able to manifest in Lost. And these abilities alone would be enough for Mother to massacre the village and fill in the well. Now, sometimes I do get pushback on that from people that question if those abilities actually are shown in the show. I think the best example of pyrokinesis is probably what happens with Ben's torch when he's in the tunnels underneath the temple visiting the monster. The flame goes out just before the monster emerges, and then reignites once it retreats back into the altar.
Daddy?
It feels like a reasonable assumption that the Man in Black is the one that was doing this to the fire. As for telekinesis, the one that I feel like is the most glaring example is when the Man in Black releases Ben from his leg restraint in the episode Dr. Linus.
I can't think of a better man for the job.
Well, it doesn't seem very likely, does it, under the circumstances? How am I going to get away from...
Now, some people have challenged that by saying that what actually happened there was the Man in Black was manipulating the electromagnetic energy to control the metal, which is fair. But setting aside the fact that metal manipulation would be virtually just as useful in massacring the village as telekinesis would be, I actually think there's another pretty good example of telekinesis, and that is all of the objects flying around the cabin in The Man Behind the Curtain.
I heard you. You said...
This, to me, is once again the Man in Black demonstrating that ability. Now, I think aside from the Man in Black, Mother is probably the most powerful person we see in regards to her harnessing the island's electromagnetic energy and manifesting it in parapsychological ways. So it is completely believable to me that she would also have those two abilities. Now, there is one more counterpoint that I want to address that people often refer to against the idea that Mother wasn't a smoke monster. And that is what she says to Jacob about what would happen if he went down into the cave.
Just promise me, no matter what you do, you won't ever go down there.
Would I die?
It'd be worse than dying, Jacob. much worse.
People point to this as her demonstrating her knowledge of what would become of someone that ended up down in the light. And I do agree that she is demonstrating that knowledge. But where I disagree is that she would only have that knowledge if it happened to her or if she witnessed it happen to someone else. Another one of the parapsychological abilities that is repeatedly demonstrated in the show is precognition. The Man in Black actually demonstrates that ability many times throughout the Across the Sea episode. When he's a kid, he just knows how to play Sinet.
What is it? It's a game. You play it. How do you know how? I just know.
And when he's building the wheel and telling Mother that once he turns it, it will transport him off island, she asks how he knows this, and he says because he's special.
How do you know all this? How do you know it will work?
I'm special.
Because he is uniquely capable of harnessing the island's energy, he has this ability of precognition. And I absolutely believe that Mother has this ability as well. And this is how I believe that she knows that going into the light will do something far worse than just killing you. She just knows things the way the Man in Black does.
If I take him, he's not ever going to be the same again.
What do you mean by that?
What I mean is that he'll forget this ever happened and that his innocence will be gone.
I believe this is because there are still trace amounts of this dark influence left in the water.
So I actually wanted to update and clarify my perspective on this. This actually came up in the comment section of a more recent video because I have recently discussed in more detail more of my thoughts on what Ben's character arc over his lifetime was and how I don't think he was the nefarious leader of the others that we meet until much closer to when 815 crashes on the island. For example, in Dead is Dead, when we get some of the flashbacks showing us how he became the leader and replaced Charles Widmore, he seems like a pretty decent guy still at this point, and certainly a much better leader. And this seems to contradict what Richard says in this scene, as well as what I said about this scene in this video. Some people think that what Richard is saying here is an explanation for why Ben is the deceptive, manipulative person that he is. And what I say about what Richard said also seems to support that idea. And that's what I want to clarify. I think what Richard means by he will lose his innocence is more along the lines of how gaining knowledge is referred to as losing one's innocence, which obviously doesn't inherently make someone bad or evil. To quote Wikipedia, a loss of innocence is a common theme in fiction, pop culture, and realism. It is often seen as an integral part of coming of age. It is usually thought of as an experience or period in a person's life that leads to a greater awareness of evil, pain, and or suffering in the world around them. So again, this phrase does not automatically mean that someone has been corrupted in some way. Richard's immediate follow-up to his loss of innocence comment is that he will always be one of us.
His innocence will be gone. He will always be one of us.
What this means to me is that by taking Ben to their temple and healing him in their sacred spring, he will become subject to their laws and culture, and they will begin asking things of him. Things to serve the island and their place on it as they see it. And we know they then do exactly that. By being initiated into their society by this religious ritual, Ben is no longer an innocent bystander to be left on the sidelines out of these very complex, very adult problems. He is now in the game, as it were. Now, in this video, I speculated that there are still trace amounts of MIB's dark influence in the water of the spring. And while I still think that could be somewhat true, in the sense that those baptized in the spring may become slightly more inclined to give in to their darker urges or temptations, I definitely prefer what I'm saying now as the main interpretation of what Richard is saying here. This is primarily because I feel that the idea that Ben's descent was caused by the spring and not his own choices and responses to events, much less compelling. I also feel that by saying the equivalent of the spring made him that way, that really lets him off the hook for all the horrible things that he ever did by making them not actually his fault. And if you take away his agency in those sins, you simultaneously undermine his eventual redemption. So again, while what I say in this video may still be true, there might still be an element of the Man in Black in the spring water, even when Jacob is alive. I think it has a minimal effect on the behavior of the people that are baptized in that spring. That is, of course, until Jacob is dead and the darkness reemerges.
I think his goal was to experiment with the energy, and in a way, the workers were guinea pigs. I think the purpose of the stone plug was to act as a dam in an attempt to maximize the energy. After all, if the Man in Black could increase the range of the source's magnetic field, he could then theoretically leave the island. However, not dissimilar to what happened with Dharma and the Swan Pocket of energy, the Man in Black's experiments resulted in the source being completely dependent on the plug, resulting in the dimmer light.
So now I'd like to jump to a comment from Lethologica02, in which they say, I do believe that the Man in Black conducted experiments on the light, but I believe those experiments were trying to cause the light to begin to fade out instead of expand. But since the cork stops the light from going out and is able to restart it, I always suspected that was an invention of Jacob's or a special Egyptian rather than being an invention of MIB's. Even though I do like the idea of MIB infecting people to force them to install the cork, but maybe he infected people to force them to create the hole, and that would cause the light to begin to drain. And so Jacob or some other group of Egyptians brought the cork in to foil their plans. So yeah, I think that actually makes at least as much sense as what I proposed in the video. What I really believe is that the Man in Black was experimenting on the light, almost certainly because he wanted to escape its hold over him, and possibly because he was also interested in growing his power. But regardless of whether or not his initial intention was to put out the light, I do think that these experimentations resulted in the light being in jeopardy and then becoming reliant on that plug. Now, it does make sense to me that Jacob and maybe his people are the ones that implemented the plug itself to fix the damage that MIB did. Like I said, I think that makes at least as much sense as the idea that Man in Black is the one that made it as part of his experiments. And in fact, I think it actually probably makes a little more sense than that. So yeah, that's definitely a good point. Now, further down in that same comment, Lethologico2 went on to say, furthermore, if the temple was built by the Man in Black's Egyptian followers, who compared him to Anubis, might this mean that the four-toed statue was built by Jacob's Egyptian followers to compare him to the depicted deity? But why would Jacob be compared to a pregnancy/protection deity when the island's pregnancy problems shouldn't have started back then? Since the creators of the show never specifically said who the statue depicted, it's possible that Jacob could have been compared to a different god. Sobek actually has the masculine features, human feet, and toothy face depicted on the island statue, is another deity of pregnancy and protection, and is also the Lord of the Waters, which would fit nicely for a protector of the island. So before getting into Sobek, I did want to add some of my thoughts on the idea of them building a statue of a fertility god or goddess. In my Getting Lost number 7 video, The Non-Productive System, I talk all about the fertility issues that Juliet is brought to the island to address, including how, why, and when those originated. And in that video, I conclude that as long as the electromagnetic energy is contained beneath the surface of the island, there do not seem to be any adverse effects on the island inhabitants. However, it is after continuous direct exposure to that energy that pregnant women start running into those issues. So I do think it is reasonable to conclude that if the Man in Black was having the Egyptian people build all of these underground structures, tunnels, etc., and doing these experiments on the source, as well as building the donkey wheel, near the orchid pocket of energy, it absolutely makes sense that the female workers that are exposed to that energy underground would develop the very same fertility issues that Juliet later tries to figure out. And I think this is likely the reason that the Egyptian settlers, specifically the ones that broke away from the Man in Black, would have erected the statue of a fertility god or goddess, in the hopes that doing so would rid them of this plague. Now that said, I have actually come to agree that the statue representing Sobek makes more sense than it representing Tauret. If you Google images of Sobek versus images of Tauret, I absolutely agree that the statue looks a lot more like the representations you see of Sobek over Tauret. My only real resistance to this idea at first was I always liked the explanation that it was Tauret, because the statue having 4 toes makes sense because hippos only have 4 toes. But as Lethologico 2 went on to point out to me, crocodiles also only have 4 toes on their hind legs. So it makes just as much sense that Sobek would have 4 toes as the idea that Tauret would. So then, taking all of the reasons that they listed for why Sobek makes sense, including that he too is a god of fertility, and combining that with the fact that in the context of the show, nobody ever refers to the statue as Tauret, I have come to embrace the idea that the statue is of Sobek as my preferred interpretation. So yeah, multiple great points in that one comment.
I imagine the Man in Black argued that Mother was insane, that her insistence that the light going out at the source would cause worldwide damage was nothing more than a delusion. I imagine Jacob responded by expressing that even if that were true, how could he ever let his brother leave now, knowing that nothing would stop him from doing to all of humanity what he had done to the Egyptian settlers.
So this brings me to the last comment I wanted to address, and this one is once again from Rochelle23. This comment and the one of Rochelle's that I addressed earlier were both part of a much larger conversation between her and I about several different topics related to this video. And once again, I do think that that is a conversation worth going back and looking at if you're watching this and you find these sort of discussions interesting. But okay, in this comment, Rochelle asks, why is it so important to Jacob that the Man in Black doesn't leave the island if his desire is just to see where he comes from, see what exists across the sea? So yeah, I went into this a little bit in the video, but I did want to go a little bit deeper here. I think prior to Mother's death, Jacob didn't want his brother to leave because he would miss him. And I think this is why he goes back to Mother and tells her that the man in black has found a way to leave. Because on some level, he knows that she will stop him. But it is after he tosses his brother into the source and turns him into the smoke monster that things change. And he begins to have much more legitimate reasons for not allowing his brother to leave. I talk in the video about how tossing the man in black into the source clearly tethered him to that energy, and how this connection is demonstrated by the fact that once the source is extinguished, the man in black becomes flesh and blood again. I view the smoke monster as this force of energy that the man in black's consciousness has become displaced onto, and that force is being generated by and therefore contained within the electromagnetic field of the source. The way I see it, the source is at, the heart of the island, and it is generating this electromagnetic field, which is basically in the form of a bubble. And the edge of that barrier, of that bubble, is what is warping space-time all around the island. And it is what is keeping the island adrift and afloat. And because of the fact that it is what is generating the energy force that is the smoke monster, that means that Smokey can only operate within that bubble. He cannot escape it so long as it is active. So what this ultimately means, and what I think the man in black eventually concluded after experimenting on the source, is that the only way he can escape is to negate that energy. If he extinguishes the source, then the electromagnetic field is no longer being generated, the island sinks, and theoretically the man in black would be free, which we know to be true from what happens in the series finale. Now, obviously, Jacob has vowed to protect this source. And while I don't think that he takes that job as seriously as Mother would have wanted at first, based on the fact that he apparently allowed the Egyptians to experiment on the source, which again, I think only really happened because Jacob couldn't bring himself to confront what he had done to his brother. I think that is why he just kind of ignored the problem of what was going on with the Egyptians and the source. But I think once it eventually became clear that the man in black was going to extinguish the source, Jacob had by that point come to understand how the energy of the island is connected to all of these other pockets of electromagnetism all over the world. And therefore, if the source goes out at the island, it will have an adverse effect on all of these other pockets. And in all likelihood, this would then cause worldwide ecological catastrophe. So regardless of whether or not you accept Mother's more spiritual explanation for why they need to protect the light, there is indeed a very real physical reason that the source going out would be very bad. So that right there is just one very good reason that Jacob can't let his brother leave. The only way he can let him leave is by putting out the source, and he can't let that happen. But as I also addressed in this video, I think the man in black subjected the Egyptians to countless horrors under his reign. His disregard for other human beings, combined with his now godlike abilities and knowledge, made the man in black perfectly willing to use, corrupt, inflict suffering upon, and destroy anyone for any reason. So even if there was a way for Jacob to let his brother go without putting out the source, he would at this point not only feel compelled to protect humanity from the source's negation, but also from the monster himself. As far as Jacob probably knows at this point, if the man in black were to leave the island, nothing would stop him from doing to the whole world what he did to the Egyptian settlers. And even if Jacob eventually surmised that putting out the light would return the Man in Black to flesh and blood form, and I'm sure he did eventually come to that conclusion, I absolutely believe that the Man in Black still would have posed a very real threat to humanity, even in flesh and blood form. Over the centuries, he has accumulated hundreds, if not thousands, of people's lifetimes worth of knowledge and experience, all of which I'm certain he would use to fairly quickly rise in power. And I think that would be a scary, scary thing. So all of this is to say, I think Jacob has several very valid reasons for not letting his brother leave. And the fact that he is responsible for his brother's state of existence makes the whole thing all the more tragic. Okay, I think that is everything. After I released this video a year ago, I went on a bit of a hiatus until September, which means there won't be another one of these follow-up videos until September of this year. Getting Lost number 15 will still be out by the end of the month. And because this month has been super crazy for me, largely because of the series I've been doing on the Saw films, I will be making the topic for Getting Lost number 15 a shorter one, similar to Getting Lost number 10, which was about Charlie's death and why he didn't lock the door from the outside instead of staying in and drowning. It'll be a topic similar to that. And then for the next few months, since I won't be doing these follow-up videos and I'll finally have the Saw stuff behind me, I'll be able to get back to bigger topics, including some ones that I've been talking about more recently, and maybe even doing more than one Getting Lost video a month. But okay, I will see you guys soon.
Oh, hello there. If you're like me, you can't get enough of Lost. So if you'd like to be notified when more videos like this one arrive, just click right up here to subscribe. In the meantime, if you'd like to check out other videos like this one, just click right up here. Or, if you'd like to check out a fun talk show filmed in an abandoned Dharma broadcast station, just click right over here. And as always, remember that this channel is like the island. It wants you to come back.